Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars. Topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Isiah. We've got a lot to talk about. First, checking in with the still red-hot Utah Jazz, then seeing some big-name stars return to the hardwood and just see how they did. We'll then check in with the Lakers, who recently were without AD or Lebron. Then we'll talk about James Harden reaching a pretty big achievement before looking over some of the big games that I made predictions on for the last podcast. And then we'll end the show with who's hot and who's not. So, starting off first with the Utah Jazz, because they just keep rolling. The Jazz have been red hot. They're on a 9-game win streak right now. So, we have to talk about them, especially since they're climbing up a Western Conference table that's super close right now. They're now in that mix of the top 3 teams. They're technically in third, but in a way, they're kind of tied for a second. There's a technicality for why they're not the ones in second, but they're behind Denver right now. But who would have thought that the top 3 would be, well, most people would suspect that the Lakers would be number 1. But then the Denver Nuggets and then the Utah Jazz, definitely didn't see that coming. But they just have been very consistent. They're playing really well. And like I said, the Western Conference is super close. 2 through 5 right now are separated by just half a game. Which is why you need consistency, especially in games where you're supposed to win. For example, against teams under 500, which is what the Utah Jazz have been doing in this big stretch of games. They've been playing extremely well, and they beat Charlotte the other day on Friday. Now, obviously, Charlotte is not very good. They're kind of, in a time where they could potentially be rebuilding, but they kind of reloaded by getting Scary Terry. Remember him? Yeah, he was the backup guy when Kyrie was hurt for the Celtics. He was pretty good. He's a good player. But against a Utah Jazz team that, is 22-3 against teams under 500, it didn't fare well for their chances in this game. The Charlotte Hornets just don't have enough really going on for them. Besides Scary Terry, who's still pretty good. He's been putting up some decent numbers this year. In this matchup against the Jazz, he actually posted 23 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists, but he really just got no help in this one, with Hernan Gomez getting 15, and then Miles Bridges getting 11 as the next highest scorers. Plus, like I've been saying, the Jazz are just too good. They had plenty of contribution in this game, and nothing really high volume, just a big team effort. A lot of people contributing in this effort to win the game. So they didn't need someone to score a high volume amount of points. In fact, the highest scorer actually came off the bench, and it was Jordan Clarkson. Jordan Clarkson had 20 points in this game. And I looked up a stat. Jazz are now 9-0 since acquiring Jordan Clarkson and waiving Jeff Green. We talked about it a couple podcasts ago. They wanted to bolster their bench and just, have somebody more reliable coming off the bench to, kind of take hold of this second unit and extend leads, hold on to leads, what have you. And Jordan Clarkson has been doing that. He's been performing really well. So I'm not sure if he was just their missing piece they're missing, or if it really is just, the Jazz have had a really easy schedule. But nevertheless, Bogdanovich in this game had 16 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists. Gobert had 15 points and 13 rebounds. So that's a big game for him, getting on the boards and getting some points as well. But the biggest stat for Gobert in this game was that he had 5 blocks. So he was getting on the boards, he was getting points, but he was also protecting the rim as well, which is what he does because he's, a former Defensive Player of the Year. He's one of the best to do it. So it's a good stat line for him. Yang had 15 points, 5 rebounds, and 9 assists. So it was a good contribution from him. And then Moutier, I kind of forget about him sometimes. I'm still surprised he's on the Utah Jazz because the Jazz have really good depth on their team. So if Moutier is playing pretty well, then that's a good sign for them. But he had 10 points, 3 rebounds, and 6 assists. And what was really interesting for me in this game is that Donovan Mitchell was so quiet. He only had 4 points in this game. So in a game where they didn't necessarily need him to score because there was contributions elsewhere, he kind of took a day off. But I wouldn't necessarily see that happening again because Mitchell's just too good to only have 4 points in one game. It's crazy to me that he only scored that many. But then on Sunday, they followed up that great win with another great team win. They were up against a Wizards team that has been struggling a lot this year. We kind of talked about them a little bit before. But they did just get their star back in Bradley Beal. He had been sitting out since January 1st, kind of nursing a lower leg injury. He's their leading scorer in points with 27.8 points per game. And their leading assist man with 6.6 assists per game. So obviously getting him back was an added boost and, an added headline in this game. But then again, the Wizards, even with Bradley Beal back, are not that good, especially since John Wall is still hurt. So, for a team as hot as the Jazz going up against this team, you would expect them to kind of roll over them. And, they kind of did that. Beal did ball out, though, on his return. He played really well, but the Jazz actually did have some high-volume scores in just many different areas this time around. Not Donovan Mitchell, though, who, I just said I'd be surprised he had 4 points again. He didn't have 4 points, but he didn't have 4 points because he didn't play in this game. He's actually out for an illness, so Moutier was actually the one that slid into the starting five. But the Wizards actually came out extremely focused in this game, kind of blitzed the Jazz early on in the first quarter. They outscored the Jazz 34-23, so obviously the Jazz had to do some adjusting and, get back into the control of the game where they really should be. And then they ended up doing just that. Bogdanovich and Ingles kind of righted the ship in the second by scoring 14 and 10 respectively. The Jazz still trailed at half, but they kind of started finding a rhythm, and they kind of took that into the second half with them. The Wizards struggled mightily shooting the ball in the third, shooting a terrible 33.3% from the field and 28.6% from three. So they just could not buy a bucket. And on the other hand, the Jazz were just heating up. They shot 61.9% from the field and 66.7% from three. So that's a big difference between the team's percentages in this quarter. And so obviously the Jazz kind of took control. They started finding their rhythm again and just really going off. But they kind of cooled down in the fourth. But the Wizards just really couldn't get anything going. So the Jazz took home their 9th consecutive win, 127-116. And that ended up putting them top 3 in the West, like I said earlier. And it's really crazy to think about them being in the top 3 when there's teams like the Clippers that are hanging around or Houston who have a bunch of star power. So for them to be up there, I think is definitely impressive. And it'll be interesting to see when the Jazz go up against some high caliber teams, if they can keep up what they've been doing against these lower tier teams in the NBA. But like I said, in this game, Bradley Beal did come back. He did play pretty well in his return. He had 25 points, 4 assists, but he could not find the long ball in this game. And I think that definitely hurt him, definitely hurt his team. He was 0 for 7 from deep. Bertrand, off the bench, had 18 points and 4 rebounds. McRae had 16 points and 6 rebounds, and then Mahimni, he had 15 points, 6 rebounds, and 7 assists with 2 steals and a block. So he really performed. He played pretty well. But the Jazz just had a good amount of players in double figures just impacting the game at different times. They all kind of took turns taking over this game. And for the most part, it was Bogdanovich leading the way. And he's really been leading the way a lot this season. Ever since he kind of broke out on the Pacers, he came over to the Jazz. He's been doing the same thing, especially in the game where Donovan Mitchell isn't in the game. Bogdanovich was going to be the one that takes the majority of the shots, and so he had 31 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists. He doesn't necessarily grab a lot of boards just because, he's got Gobert on his team, and he's got point guards and shooting guards that'll go in down low to get the rebounds. So I don't necessarily see a problem with him not getting that. he's just a high-volume scorer, really. And then Clarkson, he performed again in this game. He came off the bench, scored 23 points, had 2 boards and 3 assists, and also 2 steals, so he's helping out on the defensive end as well. And then Gobert had another monster game, 21 points, 14 rebounds, with a steal and 2 blocks. So all in all, just doing what he did in his last game, scoring points, playing well on the defensive end, just being that force down low, just making it difficult for teams to get any easy buckets. And that's just a luxury to have, a guy like him down low like that and grabbing boards at will. Ingles played really well. We had talked about him earlier in the year about how he's kind of been not as impactful as a lot of people would expect him to be. But in this game, he played really well. He had 20 points, 2 rebounds, and 9 assists with 2 steals. So I feel like Ingles is really starting to come into his own. He's kind of starting to play with a little more confidence. And his numbers have been steadily increasing. So I feel like he can take that next step and just be more consistent with it. And then this Jazz team, honestly, has such a high ceiling, and if he starts going off, Donovan Mitchell keeps progressing as well, and Bogdanovich doing what he's been doing all year long, this team's going to be a problem coming towards the playoffs. And then Moody as well, like I said, he had the start in this game. He actually played pretty well. He posted 14 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists on 6 of 10 shooting, so he had a very efficient game. He couldn't really find the long ball, but he did impact in other ways. And, they were without their best player in Donovan Mitchell, and they still found ways to win. Just with a bunch of team contributions, and that's what makes a great team, is not necessarily always having to rely on one superstar, even though that can work sometimes, as you can see in Houston, where James Harden basically just goes off every night with some help from Russell Westbrook, who does also go off in his own right. But then there's a team like the Utah Jazz, who just have a bunch of contributions from many different players and, great team wins in order to get W's, and they've been just on a roll lately. But the main storyline in this game, Bradley Beal finally came back. Obviously, it wasn't a fairy tale return, as the Jazz just continue to roll. They've just been unstoppable lately. But a couple other stars returned to the hardwood as well, so stay with us to find out who.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. We just talked about how the Utah Jazz have just been on a roll. They've won 9 straight. They've jumped into the top 3 in the Western Conference. And they've just been playing extremely well. And it's been difficult for teams to compete with them, especially since they've had a somewhat easy schedule as of late, going up against teams that are under 500. And their record is just so good against teams under 500. So they've been very consistent, and they've slowly gone their way up the table, and now they're sitting in a pretty good place right now in third, kind of tied for second, half a game in front of Houston and the Clippers. They've been playing really well. Their recent game, they just beat the Washington Wizards, which isn't a big game to win because the Wizards aren't that good, but they did get Bradley Beal back. And a couple other stars came back as well, including Pascal Siakam, who came back in his game for the Raptors against the Spurs. And, Siakam was a player that started out really hot this season and was kind of an early candidate perhaps for MVP. He was following up a year where he improved tremendously. Most people probably wouldn't have even known his name before last year. But then he started posting some big numbers, started finding ways to get to the basket and improve his points per game average. He's a great defensive force. He kind of reminds me a lot of Draymond Green with just a lot more offensive tools. And he was, he became an NBA champion last year, and he was a big reason why that team ended up winning, and a big reason why this team was so successful early on in the season as well. So he and the Raptors were up against a Spurs team who had DeRozan. So this is his return to his old stomping grounds. It's probably a bittersweet moment for him. Obviously, a lot of memories playing with the Raptors, only team he played for before moving to the Spurs, in a trade where, they kind of decided to get star power instead of sticking with, a corner piece of their franchise for as long as he was. A lot of people probably didn't like that move because there's no loyalty in it, but look where it got the Raptors. They got an NBA championship, so can't really be too mad about it, but he did return in this game. Kind of a bittersweet moment, I'm sure. And then, obviously, this Spurs team has had, just a lot to fight for. Right now, they're behind Memphis, who has been one of the hottest teams lately. We'll kind of talk about more about that later, but yeah, the Spurs are out of a playoff spot as of right now because the Grizzlies slid into 8th. So they obviously want to fight to get back into the playoff race. And then they have had some big games and big moments lately. Within the last week, they've beaten the Bucks and the Celtics. So, I mean, they're kind of on a roll against good teams. So that's kind of a problem for the Raptors because they're a good team as well. But for them to beat the Bucks and the Celtics, they're just taking out Eastern Conference teams at will. The Bucks are probably the best team in the league, other than the Lakers, who, obviously is really, really good in the West. Bucks are really, really good in the East, so that'll probably be the finals. We don't know. And then the Celtics, who are second in the East right now, too. So then the Spurs probably have a lot of confidence going up here against Toronto. So even though they have their star back in Pascal Siakam, sometimes that can kind of hurt them, like initially, because, he's been out for a while, and the chemistry just isn't the same when he first comes back. Powell also came back in this game from injury as well. So that's two players that just typically aren't in your rotation, at least as of late, and they're just getting thrown back into the mix. So it definitely can throw off your rotations. It can throw off your chemistry. They may be super rusty and not produce the way you expect them to. So it definitely can be tough for stars to come back. It's not always a fairy tale return like another player that I'll talk about later. Kind of foreshadowing there. But yeah, it looked like it wasn't going to be a big issue for the first quarter at least. Siakam had 12 points on 5 of 7 shooting in the first quarter. So it seemed that he had no rust and he was just kind of picking it up and putting it down, just playing really well. But in the second, he only added 2 more points to his tally. So he cooled off tremendously. The Raptors did take a nice 51-43 lead into halftime. But Siakam stayed quiet in the third. Powell kind of started to run his numbers up some more. And then the Raptors ballooned their lead even more going into the fourth, up 82-69. Their biggest lead was 18 at one point, and then the game kind of started slipping. As Siakam cooled off, DeRozan actually heated up and just completely took over this game. I mean, and when games like this, you have such a big lead, and then all of a sudden you kind of feel a momentum shift. And that really what happened in the fourth quarter. And then all of a sudden, the Spurs were really fighting back, clawing back this lead. Little by little, you could feel the Raptors slipping away. And the Spurs all of a sudden were up 100-91. And then it was the Raptors who were trying to make their own comeback. Ibaka ended up tying it 100-100 with a big three with 1:17 left in the fourth. And then from there, the Spurs extended the lead again, and the Raptors just fell short of a comeback. Siakam missed all of his shots in the second half, including a potential game-tying layup with just 19.2 seconds to go, and a potential game-winning three that kind of was just a desperation heave. He dribbled over half court and pulled up with like 2 people in his face, so I don't really count that. But for him to cool off as bad as he did after having such a productive first quarter was kind of disappointing to see, but can't really expect too much from him after being out for as long as he was. It's disappointing for the Raptors, though. It's another blown lead. After doing so pretty recently as well. But after the Raptors had a 74-56 lead, that big 18-point lead that they had, they got outscored 49-30, closing out the game. And that included a 27-4 run from the Spurs in the fourth quarter. So hats off to the Spurs. They really fought and clawed back and took over this game. But the Raptors, you kind of expect them to hold on to this game, especially having Siakam back, Powell back, having Lowry already being established. So it's kind of disappointing. But DeRozan did go off in his return, so it kind of makes sense. But he did have a very quiet first half. He only had 3 points, but then all of a sudden he had 22 of his game-high 25 points in the second half, including 18 after going down that big 18 deficit that they were down. So when they were down and out, he stepped up, really helped pull them back. And then he also had a monster dunk as well that if you haven't seen it yet, you definitely got to go look it up. But yeah, he finished with 25 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists with 2 steals. So he did it all. It really helped his team get back into this game. Rudy Gay as well did just that. He also had a monster dunk that you probably should look that up too, just saying. 2 crazy dunks, very aggressive. He added 15 points. But then other than that, there really wasn't any more high volume scoring for the Spurs. Really just a good team effort from everyone to find a way to get back into this game that, they should have been down and out. For the Raptors, it was a little more top heavy in terms of their production points wise. Ibaka, who has been playing really well lately, just kind of starting to find his rhythm and finding the bucket a lot more. He had 21 points and 14 rebounds in this game. So it was a really big game for him. Powell actually did really well in his return. He posted a 20.3 rebound and 4 assists stat line. Lowry had 16 points and 3 rebounds, and a season high 15 assists. So they had great production. Ibaka being your leading scorer, don't see that often. Lowry having a season high 15 assists, kind of just diamond his whole team. And then Siakam added 15 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists, but really just couldn't find his rhythm after the first quarter. So that definitely is what hurt them a lot, I think. And their defensive intensity as well. They just stopped going as hard, and the Spurs really took it to them. And, probably that's a good lesson for them to learn. Siakam said that he could have been more aggressive and will look to do more of that in the next game. Obviously, he wish he could have done better building off of that first quarter he had. But the Raptors end up dropping this one 105-104. And, kind of ruins the comeback party for Powell and Siakam. But in another return for a big game, ended a little happier on the East Coast. Kyrie Irving is back. He was injured for quite a while now with a shoulder injury. He missed 26 games. And it kind of wasn't clear when he would return. There was a lot of speculation around it. And he said he wasn't ruling out surgery, so it was kind of unclear when he would return, if he was ever going to return at all. But here he is. He's back. So he did return against the Hawks, who, without a doubt, is pretty terrible. Even worse, they were without Trae Young in this game, who has a hamstring injury right now. So you're going up against the worst team in the NBA. Without their star player, this is a perfect situation to bring back your star player and kind of have him just ease back into the game and really just, find his game without having to force himself to overdo it or play out of his comfort zone or have him try to be the guy that takes over a game. He could really just ease into it and, play well. And unlike Siakam, who fell off as the game went on, Irving just found a groove and stayed in it all game long. He played extremely well. He even ended up shooting a career-best 90.9% from the field. 90.9% from the field. The dude didn't miss. Well, he missed once, but after he missed that first shot, he did not miss again. He was 12 of 11 shooting, so he didn't shoot as much as we usually can expect from him or just are used to seeing, but still, that's very, very efficient, and that goes without saying. He paired that with 4 rebounds and 3 assists in a winning effort, 108-86. It's really just too bad that Trae Young wasn't in this game, because seeing these two go head-to-head, just because they're very similar in terms of their handles and their shooting abilities, I think it would have made it extremely more competitive and just more fun to watch. You would have seen a lot of explosiveness and a lot of big shot making. I think it would have been really fun to watch. Goodwin, who was Trae's replacement, only managed 8 points with 4 rebounds and 3 assists. So obviously nowhere near the same numbers. I mean, it's kind of hard to ask for him since Trae Young is such a generational talent. But And then Cam Reddish kind of led the way for the Hawks. He had 20 points. DeAndre Bembry added 12 alongside Alex Len, who had 10 points. So the Hawks struggled shooting for sure. Dinwiddie, who had been starting in the place of Kyrie, has, for most of the year, actually got the start alongside him. He had only had 7 points, 4 rebounds, and 8 assists, whereas LeVert, who will, I think, eventually be the starter, but just hasn't yet after 4 games back from his surgery, he had 13 points with 3 steals, so I think he was a little more productive. Him and Kyrie will be a really good tandem, in my opinion. And then DeAndre Jordan had 13 with 8 rebounds, and Taurean Prince added 14 points. The Nets are actually going up against the Jazz next, which I think would be really interesting since we just talked about them. They're red hot. But the Nets have Kyrie back, LeVert back, so it could be a really interesting match to see just how good, the Jazz are. The Nets are under 500, I believe. So, as the record shows, the Jazz should beat them. But with Kyrie coming back, I'm not sure if it's going to be an easy walk in the park for the Jazz. But after talking about all these stars coming back, on the West Coast, there were some stars that actually sat out. LeBron and AD both didn't play for the first time all year. So how did the Lakers do without their 2 biggest stars? Find out next. Stay with us.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to GSMC Basketball Podcast. We just talked about how a couple big name stars have returned to the hardwood. Pascal Siakam came back, ended up losing, giving up an 18-point lead to the San Antonio Spurs. Kind of spoiled his night. And then Kyrie Irving had a career night, shooting 90.9% from the field, a career best, and cruising to a win against a very poor Atlanta Hawks team. So it was a really good return for him. 2 big stars returning, and then 2 big stars didn't play recently for the Los Angeles Lakers. Anthony Davis and LeBron James both sitting out. Anthony Davis sustained a back tailbone injury a few games ago that I reported on my last podcast. So I'm assuming that they're just resting him. They really don't need to rush him back, so they probably just want to make sure he's good. I'm not really sure if there's been any report. There was a positive MRI result that said, nothing was majorly damaged, and he did travel with the team. He just didn't play. On the other hand, LeBron, he just had an illness. I feel like that's kind of going around the NBA right now. A lot of people are sick. LeBron actually did recently pass MJ for 4th most field goals made, and so that's a huge, huge, huge accomplishment for him, especially since, he's always been kind of just playing against the ghost of Michael Jordan his entire career. At least that's how he sees it. That's how a lot of analysts see it. He's chasing the GOAT status, and for him to pass him in another category definitely helps his statement, but I don't think anything is going to be better than 6 rings and 6 for 6 in the finals. I don't think anything will ever beat that. That's why MJ is the best. But anyway, LeBron did make another great milestone achieved. So they were without, but the Lakers in this game were without their most 2 lethal scorers and their most impactful players. So where were they going to get their production? That was the big question for sure. A lot of different players probably could have stepped up. KCP, Rajon Rondo, Kuzma, Dwight Howard, even maybe off the bench could produce. But it ended up being a new dynamic duo that kind of led the Lakers to a 125-110 win over a very good Thunder team who, we've talked about before in previous podcasts. They've just been really good. No one expected them to be. Chris Paul, Gallinari, Steven Adams, they have good pieces. Schroeder off the bench, that's just a luxury. So they've been playing really well. They've won 11 of their last 13 games, so not having LeBron or AD, it was very evident, very clear that players needed to step up. And so that duo that led them to this win ended up being Kyle Kuzma and Rajon Rondo. The two of them combined for 57 points, which actually is 4.5 more points than James and AD's combined averages. So that's saying a lot in terms of how they produced in this game. So how did they do it? Well, the two of them got off to a very hot start. Kuzma shot 5 for 6 in the first quarter and had 14 points. And Rondo shot 6 for 8 and had 12 points, and already had 7 rebounds and 4 assists. So he was already being extremely productive in the first quarter. He just came out very aggressive, kind of set the tone for this Lakers team because they needed a strong start probably, because I think coming down from a lead would be really tough for them to come back and win this game. So they had to establish themselves early, make sure their presence known, and that's exactly what they did. They outscored the Thunder 41-19 in the first quarter. So if you want a strong start, that's the way to do it. They really used this to propel them forward, and it was a tough game for the Thunder, really just to make up any ground when the Lakers came out just that aggressively. The Thunder ended up outscoring the Lakers in both the third and the fourth quarters, but any kind of comeback was really laid to rest by a tough contested three by Kyle Kuzma late in the game. And LeBron, like I said, obviously didn't play in this game, but he was very much involved. He took to his Instagram later that night to post Kuz's stat line and just show his support and just show how happy he was for the young budding star in a game where, he needed to step up, and during a time where Kuzma is surrounded with a lot of speculation in terms of maybe him being traded off to a different team. Kuzma had just scored his season best 26 points in a win against the Mavericks just a few games ago, but he dropped 36 points and had 7 rebounds in this game. So he's really making a case to stay on this Lakers team. He knows what kind of player he can be. A lot of people know what player he can be. He struggled early on in the season. People were wondering why they're not getting the right production out of him. Is he just not a good fit for this Lakers organization? And with, a LeBron-led team and AD being his sidekick, can he be that third piece in this big trio? And people really doubted that fact. And so for him to be dropping this many points in his last 2 games, maybe speaking to the fact that he can, handle the bright lights of LA with these 2 big stars. He can sit next to him and produce on a nightly basis. Maybe he's getting his rhythm now. Or, on the other hand, maybe he's increasing his stock value to get traded away. I don't think that's necessarily his plan, but he's making himself look good either way, depending however this falls. Rondo also played really well in this game. He had 21 points, 12 rebounds, and 8 assists. I don't know what he was doing getting 12 rebounds. I don't know how, but he did. And then 8 assists as well. Really good stat line, almost a triple-double in a game where, they lacked players that typically can go and get those numbers, like LeBron James, who can easily go get a triple-double whenever he wants. Anthony Davis as well, if he, improves on his passing game, but he gets double-doubles like it's nothing in terms of his points and his rebounds. So it was definitely important for Rajon Rondo to play like this. And then almost every single Laker player besides Avery Bradley, JaVale McGee, and Jared Dudley were in double-figure scoring. And that's exactly what you want to see when you're missing 2 big stars. When they're down and out, you need your entire team to step up. So that means Caruso, Quinn Cook even, Troy Daniels even, KCP, player, Dwight Howard. Every single player besides those 3 I mentioned were in double figures when their 2 highest scorers were not available. That's championship-built mentality. And speaking of championship mentality, Kuzma actually had a quote after the game saying, everybody on this team has something to prove. AD is trying to win a ring. Bron is trying to win one in LA. I'm trying to establish myself. Dwight's redemption. We don't take games lightly. We want to go out and dominate every game. We don't see why we can't win every game. That's the kind of mentality that they need to have. I look over at the other side of LA on the Clippers Nation. When they're losing games to really poor teams. They should go out and win every single game, but they don't. And it's part of it because, they're still figuring out how to play with each other and team chemistry-wise, but I feel like they don't compete as hard. And that's why the Lakers are in first and the Clippers aren't. And honestly, it makes me think, is Kyle Kuzma really back? Because he had great production last year. Like I said, he was struggling earlier in this year, but he may be establishing himself now. Thunder played pretty well despite losing this game. And then, Chris Paul versus Rajon Rondo is always interesting to watch. These two always seem to have little scraps, little fights. There was a little one in this game as well. No big deal. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, he continues to produce. He's been playing extremely well this season. Probably going to get Most Improved Player of the Year. He had 24 points, 8 rebounds, and 8 assists in this game. Gallinari, who's kind of slept on in my opinion, he had 24 points, 2 rebounds, and 3 assists. Chris Paul, he does what he does. He's been playing some of his best basketball, kind of revitalizing his career again in the Thunder, where a lot of people thought, his career was done if he was going to the Thunder because they weren't going to do anything, obviously. But he played pretty well in this game. He scored 16 points, had 5 rebounds, and 8 assists. And then Schroeder, like I said, coming off the bench, having him coming off the bench is a luxury. 13 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 assists. So, obviously, some good contributions from the Thunder. It just wasn't enough. This Lakers team is just so good. And for them to play as well as they did without their 2 biggest stars, it just speaks to their greatness. And it just shows why they're in first place in the West. Because when you're this deep and you don't need to, necessarily rely on these 2 big stars to help you win every single game. And against a team that's been playing really well in the Thunder, like I said, 11 of their last 13 games they've won. That's a good sign for them. It means that they're on track to be a championship team. Because when these 2 stars come back and they're producing like they do, and then you have your second unit come in, if they produce like this, they're in good shape. And I think that the Lakers are going to go really far because of it. Another team in the West Coast saw some history be achieved. Who else but James Harden making headlines again? We'll talk about what achievement he reached in his last game coming up next.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Isiah. We just talked about how the Lakers were without LeBron and AD, and a lot of people would probably think, if they don't have their 2 biggest stars, they're probably going to lose that game, especially against a team like the Thunder, who have been playing really well, won 11 of their last 13 games. But no, other players stepped up, and they found a way to win. Kuzma and Rondo led the way. But pretty much every single player on that Lakers team besides 3 scored in double figures. So there was a high volume of contribution throughout their roster. And, they found a way to win against a really hot team. And it just speaks to their greatness, and it shows why they're first in the West right now. And another team in the West, kind of had another historic night in the way of James Harden. And now we know James Harden, is playing at a crazy level this season because I've talked about it a lot on these podcasts. He's just scoring at will. His points per game average is ridiculous. But we got to talk about him again because, he recently passed 20,000 points, which is a big milestone to achieve, whether he wants to really pay it attention or not. He kind of brushed it off. He thinks, it's a great achievement, but he's got a higher goal, which makes sense, that the ultimate goal is to win a championship. We get it, but it's a cool accomplishment for sure. And Russell Westbrook, kind of brought it back and said, yeah, James is going to say we want to win a championship, but let me say something. It's a pretty big deal. And that's coming from the guy who played with him and saw his first points as, a member of the Thunder team all those years ago. So for him to be here now, it's definitely impressive for sure. That's not all, though. He also set some history in a negative aspect as well that just kind of put a blemish on the night as a whole. He had 11 turnovers. Not only that, he had 11 turnovers in the first half. He had 11 turnovers in the first half. I don't even know how that's possible, but that's just rough. And it's also just the most in a half by any player in the last 20 seasons. And if you count it in terms of stats, he had a triple-double with turnovers by halftime. That's just crazy to me. But this was now his 6th career game with 30 or more points and 10 or more turnovers, which is just twice as many as any other player in NBA history. He does score at a ridiculous rate, like I say, but he's just too careless with the basketball and kind of puts a negative aspect to this historic night that he had. But nevertheless, the main headline is that he got to 20,000 points, and he's the 7th youngest to do it, the 45th overall, but the 7th youngest to do it, and that's pretty impressive. And it just speaks to his greatness, and it makes sense because he has such high volume scoring, so it's bound to happen soon anyway. And he'll be, kind of at the top of the list, I would assume, when it's all said and done, especially at the volume he's scoring. Pretty cool little factoid as well, side fact. He got the game ball at the end of the game, and he gave it to his mom. Kind of, credited her for everything, said she'll keep it safe. And I know, I just love seeing big stars show love to their family, especially their mothers, because, it just really shows their human side. We kind of look at these superstars and think, they're not just regular guys because they're these big superstars that can do amazing things, but at the end of the day, they're just like us. And he had to give credit to his moms, and I thought that was really cool. Even though this big momentous occasion happened, and it was great, this was a great moment for them, the Rockets unfortunately lost PJ Tucker in the first quarter. He fell on his shoulder, and they were already playing without Capella, who had a bruised heel. So the the Rockets are kind of falling apart right now, and it's tough to see for them, since they've been playing so well. Not sure when players are going to be returning, but, there was no doubt that they should win this game. They were stacked up against a very, very underwhelming team in the Minnesota Timberwolves. And the Rockets, however, they did just lose to the Thunder. So, I think it was important for them to bounce back just in the right way, especially against a team that was playing as poor as the Timberwolves were. And they really just didn't put up much of a fight. Their highest scorer having 16 points in Josh Okogie. So that's obviously not a good sign to begin with. And then Jarrett Culver had 15 points, 8 rebounds, 5 assists. The Timberwolves were without Towns, so that obviously hurts a lot. He's a big contributor in terms of points and rebounds. He could have been all over the boards, especially in a game where, Capella wasn't in there. So I feel like he could have been really productive in this game if he was available, just because, the backup center in Isiah for the Rockets is a really good center, but I don't think he could have matched up against Towns as well. But either way, it really just didn't matter because the Rockets have James Harden and Russell Westbrook, and they completely carried. Harden's final stats were 32 points, 12 rebounds, and 8 assists, and he had 2 steals as well. So he keeps getting a good amount of steals per game, I've been noticing. So it really makes me wonder, is he a good defender or not? He can choose to be, I feel like. but for the most part, he's going to focus on the offensive end. Westbrook found ways to contribute as well. He scored 30 points, 6 rebounds, and 10 assists with 2 steals in his own right. So Westbrook really finding his groove now. 10 assists, I think that's really impressive for him. 6 rebounds as well. So he was pretty close to a triple-double, just like James was. And then these two were, the first pair of Rockets teammates to each have 30 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists in a game since Hakeem Olajuwon and Robert Horry in 1994. So setting history in another way as well. Isiah Hardenstein, who I kind of talked about a while back, being just a great backup center, a good luxury for the Houston Rockets to have. Since Capella was hurt in this game, he had to be the guy in the starting lineup, and he balled out. He had 17 points, and he grabbed 15 boards with 2 steals and 5 blocks. That's the biggest stat line for me, for sure. He did grab 15 boards, which is impressive. Added 17 points, that's impressive. But for him to have 5 blocks just showed that he had a really good game protecting the rim, where they were missing their biggest rim protector in Capella. And so he kind of slid into this big 3 role, because it's usually James Harden, Russell Westbrook, and Capella. He slid in there and he's like, I can fill in pretty well. And he did just that. Really producing on the defensive end, playing really well. And then Eric Gordon also had 17 points. So he's starting to find his contributions a little more and more. He didn't shoot it at a great percentage, but he did find the final product in terms of his points value. So he's playing pretty well. The Rockets are now tied for 4th, with the Clippers technically behind them. It's on a technicality, but both of them are just half a point out of second place. And it's just crazy to me how close this Western Conference is. The Houston Rockets obviously are a fantastic team. I think they can probably end up being in the top 3 when it's all said and done. But who knows just how bad these injuries are really going to be. I hope Capella's not out too long, and I don't think Tucker should be out too long. He did fall on his shoulder, but I don't think it was anything serious. I haven't seen anything yet. But yeah, the Houston Rockets have a great chance to be one of the best teams in the Western Conference. I'm not sure if the Utah Jazz have what it takes to sustain what they've been doing. They've just been winning a lot of games against under 500 teams. But if you match up the Houston Rockets versus the Utah Jazz, I'm probably going to take the Rockets just because of James Harden. The high volume scoring that he has, paired with Russell Westbrook's just raw, aggressive talent, is just going to be too much for the Utah Jazz, I think. And even against a team like the Denver Nuggets, too. The Denver Nuggets and Utah Jazz, in a lot of ways, feel similar to me. They kind of have a lot of good contributions throughout the team, but not necessarily have rely on one player. Where, a lot of people would think that's probably better. But when you have a player as good as James Harden, who can drop 40 or 50 out of nowhere, most teams would probably take that over a good contributing team throughout the stat line than, a big star any day. So I think it'd be tough for sure. And then, like I said, they're kind of tied with the Clippers right now, who I think should be in the top 3 too. I think at the end of the day, it should be the Lakers, the Rockets, and the Clippers in that top 3. So it'll be interesting to see how this whole thing shakes out. It's really cool to see how close it is in that 2 through 5 section, with 6, 7, and 8 kind of sneaking behind. They're not that close, but they are sneaking around. Mavericks as well can be in that conversation. But it's really important that, the Rockets got this win, and it's even cooler that Harden got the win and got to 20,000 points. So, there were some other big games happening since the last podcast I did, and so I wanted to make some predictions on these games, which I did last podcast. And let me just say, I might stop doing these predictions because I think I was wrong about pretty much all of them. But, we'll look over these big games anyway, coming up after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. We just talked about how James Harden has reached a career milestone, 20,000 points. And it's just really impressive to see, and it's no surprise at all with the high volume scoring that he has, especially in his last few seasons. He just seems to get better and better at finding ways to score. He's just so lethal, probably one of the best scorers in NBA history. When it's all said and done, he'll be up there with, on the top scoring list for sure. And they just got a big win against a Minnesota team that hasn't been very good, and they're without Karl Anthony Towns. So it was a game in which they definitely should have won, and they did. They took care of business, and they got a win. That wasn't necessarily a big marquee matchup, but there were some big matchups over the last couple of days that I made some predictions about in the last podcast. Let me just give you a preview. They didn't go that well in terms of my predictions, but they were still great games to watch. On Thursday, the Celtics were matched up against the 76ers. And I kind of said, the 76ers, they don't have Embiid now. He has to get surgery on his hand because he messed up his finger. So I said, no Embiid, no party. Celtics are going to win, even without Kemba, potentially, because that was kind of up in the air. He was kind of day-to-day at the time. And so let me give you some back information. Embiid ended up not playing. Kemba did. So, I think most people would say, Sixers are without one of their biggest stars. The Celtics actually have one of their biggest stars. So it should be an easy win for the Celtics, right? No, it wasn't. Of course not, it wasn't. They started out great. They were winning 35-26 after one. They came out hot, especially Kemba, who had 13 in the first quarter. But the problem was that they cooled off real bad and allow the 76ers to kind of start to come back and gain confidence. And that's the worst thing you can do, is let a team back in. Boston would get outscored in the rest of the quarters, and worst of all, in the fourth, 32-18. And no player had more than 5 points in the fourth quarter for the Celtics, whereas Josh Richardson almost outscored the entire Celtics team by himself with 14 fourth quarter points. The game ended with the Sixers winning 109-98. And I definitely didn't see that coming at all, because how would you have expected the Sixers to beat a team like the Celtics the way that they've been playing versus how the Sixers have been playing, plus they didn't have Embiid? I went with a logical guess, but didn't work out. Kemba played really well. He had 26 points, 2 rebounds, and 3 assists. But I think he needs to do more. He can definitely get those assist numbers up. He could probably go grab a couple more boards as well, but they don't necessarily need him to. But the assist numbers for sure need to go up. Marcus Smart off the bench had 24 points. Tatum was a little underwhelming. He had 15 points, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, but he also had 4 turnovers, so I thought he was a little too careless with the basketball. But really overwhelming, and just someone I expect a lot more from was Jaylen Brown. He had 6 points, only 6 points, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, and he had 3 turnovers as well. So he just had a really, really poor game in a big matchup that, you would expect him to show up and perform. Gordon Hayward too. He did not play well either. He had 8 points, 2 rebounds, and 2 assists. I know for a fact that those two players can definitely produce more. And, if they did produce more, I probably would have been right on my prediction. But no, they just didn't want to show up. The Sixers were led by Josh Richardson. He had 29 points, 3 rebounds, and 7 assists. I could have probably seen that coming because who else is going to be the one to get the high amount of points other than Josh Richardson? Maybe Ben Simmons, who he played pretty well too. He had 19 points, 9 rebounds, and 3 assists. I'm surprised he only had 3 assists. But 9 rebounds makes sense. He's down there, down low when Embiid's not, so he probably took over in that aspect. Al Horford played one of his better games of the season. He's been struggling in terms of his impact. He hasn't been as good as he has been in years past. He had 17 points, 8 rebounds, and 6 assists in this game, which was a really good stat line for him. And then Tobias Harris had 16 points, 7 rebounds, and 3 assists. So I don't really know. I thought even still the Celtics probably should have won this game, but they didn't, obviously. And so moving on, the Lakers played the Mavericks on Friday, which is a pretty big Western Conference matchup. But I had a lot of contingencies on this game. I said if Anthony Davis is hurt, then the Mavs win. But if not, I think they lose, especially if they don't have Porzingis. But I don't know. I said a lot of different scenarios. I think I'm just going to go with what I think I should have said was that the Lakers are going to win, because why would I doubt the Lakers? Especially if the Mavericks don't have Porzingis. Luka is just one man. He can't do it all. So I definitely think the Lakers should have won this game. Spoiler alert, they do. AD did not play, but neither did Porzingis. So that definitely hurts their game a lot. I think I went with the Lakers. I may just be saying this just to make myself look better, because the Lakers end up winning this one 129-114. I mean, duh. The Lakers are just so good, even without one of their biggest superstars. And it helps when Kuzma's actually playing to his potential, like we kind of talked about earlier on in the podcast. The Lakers absolutely torched the Mavs in the first, and that really set the tone. They outscored them 45-27 in the first quarter, and it was actually led by Kuzma, who had 11 in the first. Whereas the Mavs, they just shot terrible. They shot 35.7% from the field and 18.2% from 3. You can't expect to beat a team like the Lakers shooting the ball like that. So things started to get a little bit better for the Mavs in terms of their percentages, and they kept up a little bit better in the second quarter, but Kuzma and LeBron stayed hot. Each of them had 10 in the second quarter. And then the Lakers actually cooled off big time in the third, just not shooting the ball well at all, but the Mavs didn't shoot it considerably well either, so not much ground was made up. And then finally LeBron closed out the fourth with another 10 points and just buried the Mavs, where on the other hand, Luka only had 4 points in the fourth quarter, which is pretty disappointing to see because he's one of the bright stars in the NBA, and he definitely needs to show up in crunch time. And unfortunately, he did not in this game. Mavs fall. Luka overall did play pretty well, though. He led the way for the Mavs. He had 25 points, 10 rebounds, 7 assists. But he had 6 turnovers, so that's definitely an aspect of his game that he needs to improve on. I feel like I've looked at a couple of his stat lines over this year, and he's had a good amount of turnovers here and there, so definitely something he wants to work on. Tim Hardaway Jr. played really well. He had 22 points, 7 rebounds, and 1 assist. And then Seth Curry had 16 points. Boban Marjanovic had 14 points and 10 boards, which is a really good stat line for him. But it was just no match for the Lakers and LeBron, who had 35 points, 16 rebounds, 7 assists. Crazy numbers. I would have expected him to get more assists since he's leading the league in assists. And I definitely would have expected him to get his triple-double in that case. But even still, that stat line goes crazy. Kuzma had 26 points, which was his season high until his most recent game that we just talked about earlier on in the podcast. He also had 6 rebounds and 2 assists, so he played really well. Rondo and Howard each had 10 points. But after that, no double-digit scoring, just enough contribution from the squad to get over the hump. And so the Lakers took that one. I definitely made that prediction. I'm just going to, make sure that I look good at least a little bit, because in this next game, I did not get this right at all. I mean, it was kind of a a bold prediction. It was the Pelicans versus the Celtics on Saturday. And I went with the more bold choice just for fun, and it ended up backfiring. The Pelicans lose this game. I gave it to the Pelicans because, I thought Lonzo Ball was playing really well as of late after coming back from an injury. The Pelicans were just rolling. Ingram has been playing really, really well as of late. He could be most improved player of the year. They've just been playing really well, really confidently. And so I thought, maybe they would surprise the Celtics and win this game. But the problem was Jason Tatum decided to have a career night. He had 41 points on 16 of 22 shooting in just 3 quarters. Like, dude, where was this against the Sixers when I predicted the Celtics would beat the Sixers? So annoying. But he went off. I mean, that's a great performance for him. I've talked about his potential and where he can go as a player. He could definitely be a star in this league. 41 points, that's crazy. Played really well. The Pelicans got blown out in this game, 140-105. So I was not even close with my prediction. And there was a lot of reasons why. Boston had a hot first quarter and third quarter. In the first, they outscored the Pelicans 41-24, led by Tatum with 11 and Hayward actually with 8 points. Then in the second, Frank Jackson for the Pelicans scored 12 to match Tatum's 11 again. But I was just so confused. Frank Jackson, he does not play that much. He's not a high-minute player, but he got a lot of minutes in this game, and I'll tell you why in a little bit, but he played pretty well. He played well in that second quarter. Boston had a considerable lead going into halftime, and then in the third, they really just buried the Pelicans. They outscored them 42-25 in this quarter, and Tatum had 19 in this one and just sat the rest of the fourth because he had played that well. So his career high 41 definitely could have been a lot higher. The Pelicans never stood a chance, even though I really thought they would. Frank Jackson led in scoring with 22 points. That's the first problem. Jackson Hayes was second in scoring with 20 points. That's the second problem. Ingram only had 16 points, 3 rebounds, 5 assists. Definitely not what I would have expected from him. He has the potential to, perform a lot better than that. Lonzo's points are back to, normal. He had been scoring over 20 for a good amount of games in a row. He only had 10 in this game, but he did have 13 rebounds and 9 assists, so he almost had a very quiet triple-double, but he did have a quiet double-double, so it was a pretty decent performance for him, but I still think he can push his numbers up for scoring more consistently. But the biggest problem was, and what hurts the most, is that the Pelicans didn't have Drew Holiday, Derek Favors, or Redick, all due to illness. So I just don't think that's fair. I can't really count this prediction as being a thorough one because they're missing 3 of their best players. The Celtics did play really well, though, so got to give it to them. Tatum scored his career high, like I said, 41 points, added 6 boards and 4 assists with 3 steals. So he did it all. Cantor, though, I think had the most impressive stat line. 22 points, 19 rebounds. He went off, got on the boards, and just went off. Crazy. I wouldn't have expected that from Cantor. Hayward actually played pretty well, 19 points, 5 rebounds, 3 assists. Kemba did his thing, 17 points, 5 rebounds, 7 assists. So maybe we'll have more of these predictions. I really don't know. I might just retire, to be honest. But the Celtics were really hot that night. But will they make the hot list? I give you my top 5 for who's hot and who's not coming up next.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. We just talked about some big games that happened over the last few days that I made predictions on, and I was kind of wrong on a couple of them. We're just going to breeze past that. No big deal. Lakers beat the Mavs, Sixers beat the Celtics, and then the Celtics end up beating the Pelicans. Some big games happening, and not exactly the predictions I thought would have happened. The Celtics most notably beat the Pelicans because it was just a blowout. They were on fire that night. Jason Tatum, career-high night with 41 points, so they were hot that night. But now we're going to switch gears and talk about who's hot and who's not. And the Celtics actually do not make my list, so we're going to talk about that. Actually, they do make my list at the very end, though, so we'll talk about that. We'll start with number 5. I'm going to say, for who's hot, number 5, the Spurs, who have just been beating some big teams as of late. The Celtics, that's how they make my top 5. Get it? They lose to the Spurs. The Spurs also beat the Raptors and the Milwaukee Bucks in the span of a week. So they did that with not great pieces either. They have DeMar DeRozan. I think Patty Mills is really good from time to time. Aldridge can show up and produce. Rudy Gay as well, but they just haven't been playing that well this season, especially because the Western Conference is just crazy. So it's hard for them to gain any ground. They're sitting in 9th right now, but technically tied for 8th. But tied with the Memphis Grizzlies, but they're out of a playoff spot right now. So they've been putting a lot of games together, been playing really well. And beating big-name teams. So that's why they're number 5 on my list. Coming in at number 4 is the Houston Rockets. And I'm going to pair them with the Thunder because they're both 7-3 in their last 10. And we talked about them earlier on in the podcast. The Rockets, are just very notably good because of their 2 biggest stars in James Harden and Russell Westbrook. Even though they don't have Capella, they just lost Tucker as well. It doesn't matter because those 2 can carry a team. James Harden especially, just an outpouring of points every single game. On the other spectrum, the Thunder, they win a bunch of games too, but it's more team-based. Steven Adams, their centerpiece. Chris Paul kind of revitalizing his career, showing that he's still got it. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander showing that what the Clippers are missing out on by trading him away. He's having a great year, playing extremely well. And Gallinari as well. He's a good spot-up shooter, good catch-and-shoot player. And, they've just got a good rhythm going on right now, and that's how they've been winning a lot of games. So both of those 2 teams, 7-3 in the last 10, they're number 4 on my list. And then coming in at number 3 is the Memphis Grizzlies. I really didn't think I'd ever say that because of how poorly I talked about them when I first started these podcasts. But wow, they've been hot. They've won their last 5 games. They're 7-3 in their last 10, and they're currently in a playoff spot. And within these last 10 games, they've been that hot Thunders team I just talked about, the Clippers, who should be one of the best teams in the NBA as a whole, and the Spurs, who have been known to surprise bigger teams, so they have potential to win big games. And the Memphis Grizzlies beat them. They have Ja Morant, who's I think undoubtedly going to be the Rookie of the Year. The kid is just so good. He's so aggressive. He's so explosive. And he has so many aspects to his game that make him great. When he goes to the rim and slams it down, he reminds me a lot of Russell Westbrook. When he's dribbling outside, he's got handles like Trae Young, like Steph Curry, like Kyrie. He's just a star. He will be one of the best players in the NBA in the next couple of years. I guarantee you that. He's got Dylan Brooks as well, who's, not necessarily a star, obviously, but, he's a good role player for sure. Jay Crowder, one of the better defenders in the league. His numbers have gone down this year, but he's still that veteran presence that this team needs, I think. Jaren Jackson Jr. going off this year, playing really well, paired up with, Ja Morant as just a good pairing, I think. And then Valanciunas is one of the better centers in the league. So they got a squad. And since December 8th, they're 11-6, and they are number 1 in points per game with 118.9 points per game. They're number 1 in field goal percentages with 49.3%. They're number 1 in assists with 29.6 assists per game. They're number 1 in points in the paint with 55.3. They're number 3 in three-point field goal percentage with 38.4%. And they're number 4 in fast break points with 17.2. Like, wow. I don't understand how they became so good all of a sudden. But to be in the top 5 in all of these categories and being in number 1 for most of them is extremely impressive. And I don't know if they'll be able to sustain it, but for now, they're one of the hottest teams in the NBA, which is why they make my top 3. Coming in at number 2, it's the pairing that I always have just because I don't know how to separate these two teams. The Lakers and the Bucks. They're just both extremely consistent, star-studded, and unbeatable. The Lakers are on an 8-game win streak, and they, have won a couple games without AD, and then they just won a game without LeBron and AD. So it's just that much more impressive that they're on this 8-game winning streak still. And their differential in terms of points margin for their wins has been going up as well. They are at a margin of victory of plus 8.3, and they're also 5 games clear at the top of the Western Conference. It's kind of scary, too, that Kuzma's getting his groove. And if he continues to play the way he's been playing, I think, you can wrap up the championship now. But the only team that has something to say about that are the Bucks. They're on a 3-game win streak in their own right. 8-2 in their last 10 as well. Their differential in terms of their point margin went down just a bit, but they're still balling. I mean, they're killing teams still, but with over a win margin of plus 12 point something, I believe. And then having Bledsoe back really helps, and his contributions are being felt for sure in these last few games. And they're 7 games clear, of second place. The second place Boston Celtics are 7 games back from the Milwaukee Bucks. So that's how dominant they've been. Those two are number 2 on my Who's Hot list. And coming in at number 1 is the Utah Jazz. The second week in a row. They're 9-1 in the last 10 games. They've won 9 straight, and they're doing it in just different ways with different personnel. They're beating teams under 500 right now, but by doing so, they're growing confidence. And then they're in third on a technicality, but really tied for second. They're 5 games back from the Lakers. They're contributing all across their roster, from Donovan Mitchell to Bogdanovich to Ingles sometimes to Gobert. They just have so many pieces that can, take the initiative to lead the team to a victory. So for me, they're the hottest team in the NBA right now. Just keeping an eye on them. I don't necessarily think that they're going to stay there the whole season, but for right now, they're pretty exciting to watch. So that's my top 5. Some honorable mentions are the Pelicans, who are 7-3 in their last 10 in their own right, but they're still second to last in the West, so that's why I couldn't necessarily throw them in the top 5. But they have been playing really well as of late. The Magic also, who are 6-4 in their last 10 and are now 8th in the East. So not sure how they're doing so well, especially since Jonathan Isaac is out for a couple months with that knee injury. But yeah, they're finding ways to win too, and so they get an honorable mention from me. Now moving over to who's just not hot in the NBA. Coming in at number 5 are the Kings, the Bulls, the Nets, the Pistons. And I paired all of them as an honorable mention, really, for number 5, because they're all 3-7 in their last 10. They're all really poor ball clubs right now. Sacramento Kings are very disappointing to me. I think they could be one of the better teams in the Western Conference if they had some consistency and if their stars really performed the way they should be. They've got De'Aaron Fox. They've got Buddy Hield. They've got Bogdanovich for themselves. They've got Marvin Bagley. They've got pieces to be a good team. They got Deadman as well. I just think they should be producing a lot more than what they've been doing. So for them to be playing as poorly as they are is really upsetting. The Bulls as well, they have Zach LaVine. He's a stud. Can't necessarily do it all by himself. They're kind of in a rebuild too, so that sucks for them. The Nets are 3-7 in the last 10, but they just got Kyrie back, so I expect them to start going on a tear. He's going to be leading them. The Nets are going to go up the Eastern Conference pretty soon here if he stays healthy. The Pistons, on the other hand, are not healthy. Blake Griffin may be out for the entire year, not sure yet. And Andre Drummond's kind of, in a world of his own right now, since Reggie Jackson's hurt as well. So that's upsetting for them. That's number 5 on my who's not. Coming at number 4 are the Charlotte Hornets, who are 2-8 in their last 10 games. They're on a 4-game losing streak, and they had those 2 wins against the Mavs and the Cavs after a 6-game losing streak. So that was already a tough stretch for them. They win those 2 games, but then they lost their last 4. And they do have a kind of a tough schedule, but most of them just not being close games, except for their game against the Raptors, where they only lost by 2. But other than that, they typically were getting not blown out, but beaten pretty convincingly. So they're number 4 on my list. Number 3 are the Blazers, who are just so disappointing. I really don't understand why they're so bad. They're 2-8 in their last 10. They're on a 2-game losing streak, and they lost to teams like the Timberwolves, the Knicks, the Suns, and now they're 3 spots away from a playoff spot. I don't know what it is that's going on in Portland, but it might be time for them to give up on what they've been doing, blow it up, and just restart, because clearly Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum, even though they're one of the best backcourts in the NBA, they can't win. They just can't do it. They added Carmelo Anthony, they won a couple games, and now they're back to losing. They have Hassan Whiteside as well, so I don't know. I feel like the Blazers are kind of a lost cause at this point, and I don't know how they're going to right the ship, really. So they're number 3 on my list. Number 2 are the Atlanta Hawks. They're on a 4-game losing streak. They're 2-8 in their last 10, and they have the worst record in the NBA. Not to mention that now Trae Young is hurt as well, so things can only get worse for the Hawks. I don't see them winning any games while he's out, because where are they going to get the contribution from? So they're number 2, but I hate to say this, it pains my heart. The worst team in the league right now, and number 1 on my who's not hot list, are the Golden State Warriors. Sucks to say, but they're on an 8-game losing streak. They're 2-8 in their last 10. They're last in the West and the second worst record in the NBA, so I got to put them here. As much as it pains me, they've just been really poor. I mean, it sucks that they've had so many injuries. They've been, managing minutes for Draymond Green. D'Lo's been in and out with injuries. They still don't have Steph or Clay, so it's a rough time for Dub Nation. But I see the tides turning at some point. So if you're a Golden State Warriors fan like me, be patient. Eventually, things will get better, hopefully. But that's going to do it for my who's hot and who's not lists, and that means that's going to do it for this podcast as well. So thank you for listening to the GSMC Basketball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that really helps us out. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, that would be greatly appreciated. I'm Isiah Kidos. Thank you, and see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.